Is there a mic somewhere?
No mic, sorry, there's only one mic.
Okay.
Speak up.
Right.
Yeah, I have a question regarding this topic, that we keep going back and analyzing our past colonial happenings and how we are race-based today. But is it not? I am particularly interested in the way you mentioned that it would be funny if we had 14 Republican parties for the female, blacks, and whites in the States. Well, I noticed that the difference between the United States and us is that in the United States, everyone speaks English. There is no different vernacular schools. There is no different identity. Second or third generation of immigrants, children, no longer identify themselves with, say, most Spanish don't speak Spanish, most Latinos don't speak Spanish at all. But perhaps in Malaysia, the race-based politics and happenings is by fear that we lose our identity. For instance, our children, we send them to, say, Mandarin-based schools or Tamil-based schools. In fact, it's so funny that I find that today we talk about the Malaysia and different of race and how we should be Malaysian and how we blame the colonial past, yet we speak all these things in the very language of our colonial past instead of the national language that we would unite us. So isn't it that the race base is not partly is blamed because of the colonial past, but more because of fear of losing identity and the fear of integration into one identity?
Well, I think in a way you've touched on an important point. But this goes back to the point I said earlier about how by the 1920s and 30s in Southeast Asia, across the board, but specifically in Malaysia, we begin to see the emergence of early modes of mass political mobilization. Unfortunately, and this is a problem with racism, you see, and it's very hard to oppose racism without internalizing the logic of racism itself. The real success of South Africa is that in the post-apartheid regime, they've not created another apartheid that is simply reversed it. And that's very, very, very difficult to do. Unfortunately, if you look at the context of Southeast Asia from the 20s and 30s and all the way up to the 50s and 60s, that first generation of anti-colonial leaders, men and women, were in many ways working with the tools that they had at hand. The very idea of a state, a nation state. Remember, the nation state is an equally new idea to Southeast Asia. There were no nation states. The idea that you have a geographical entity with a fixed boundary, political boundary, and that within this fixed territoriality you would have also certain ethnic identities that are deemed to belong and others that are deemed as not to belong. The early letter that I read from the refugee precisely sums up the predicament of people who don't accept the idea of a nation state. So in many ways, much of Malaysian politics from the 20s and 30s all the way up to the 40s and 50s reflected that. So the concerns you raised about vernacular language. In the past, there was never a problem with vernacular language. There was never a problem with vernacular language for two reasons. One, there's enough evidence to suggest that Southeast Asians were far more polyglot then than they are today. People spoke a number of languages, and people were comfortable. Secondly, people did not claim these languages. So languages could become lingua franca. So what do you call, Bahasa Malaysia today? I'm still not sure, because some days it's Bahasa Malaysia, some days it's Bahasa Melayu, so these things change every 24 hours. But this lingua franca was precisely that. It was a lingua franca for everyone. It was spoken by the Dutch, the English, the Portuguese. It was spoken by the Spanish. It was spoken by all the communities that were here, and they spoke it comfortably because no one claimed that language as theirs. That's why recently, when there was this controversy about the use of the word Allah in the Christian journal, for me this is ridiculous, because one of the first people who translated the Bible into Bahasa Malaysia was Munshi Abdullah, and he had no problems with that. Munshi Abdullah today is regarded as the father, the pioneer of realist Malay literature, and yet there was no problems then. There was no problem to use this language in a mixed milieu, because that milieu was mixed. The problem is, language politics becomes complicated once you have racial differences setting in, and then specific ethno-linguistic communities claim that language as theirs. And I think the predicament faced by those who wanted to foreground Bahasa Malaysia as the national language in the Malaysian case was that the very same people who wanted to foreground Bahasa Malaysia as the national language were themselves ethno-nationalists, right-wingers, who were championing other things, including Malay supremacy. Now, it's very difficult to get anyone to speak Bahasa Malaysia when you're told that this is the language of one specific community and this community has special rights over you. Now, the reason why it's easier for an immigrant to learn English in America is that when, I don't know, some guy from Ghana or Indonesia or whatever migrates to America and is told to learn English, nobody tells him that this is the language of the whites and we're the special community and you better learn our language, otherwise we kick you out. You see? That doesn't happen in America, it doesn't happen in Australia, it doesn't even happen in Europe. French citizenship is based on two things, the notion of citizenship and language. The French language is the language of everyone. And you're not told, in fact, the really right-wing French nationalists are quite unhappy that Arabs speak French very well in France, because they can't claim the French language as theirs anymore. And this sense of sharing the Malay language to make it a Malaysian language is precisely what we lost. We lost because a bunch of right-wing racists basically used this language as a stamp of their specific ethno-racial superiority over others. But where does this come from? Again, it goes back to the dates. It goes back to the introduction of the colonial census. The notion of different races, different communities, each having different traits. You are race A, so you speak language A. You eat food A. You dress A. You walk A, because you are different. So this is your language. And if someone else wants to learn this language, he or she has to concede to your specific ethnic terms. I think that's the thing that's complicated. Politics of language in Malaysia. Malaysian language can be a lingua franca the way it was before, as long as it's decoupled from this false association that it is the language of one race. The Malay language is 40% Sanskrit, 40% Arabic. The language itself is already hybrid. It is already Peranakan. It is already Mongol. It is already mixed. So accept that, and then you can share it. But you're not going to promote Bahasa Malaysia as the national language as long as you promote that on the premise that this is a language of a specific elite community that is superior to other communities. That simply will not work. So I think that again is testimony to the contradictions of race politics that we have in Malaysia.
Farish, okay, correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, as far as I know, it is said in the Constitution that being a Malay means that first you are a Muslim, then you speak the Malay language, and then third you practice the Malay customs. Okay, when this actually came about, and if I know you are a political historian, can you describe the situation from
before?
Yeah, perhaps in Malacca, where they used to speak 84 languages in the market, but the lingua franca is Malay. How do you apply this whole concept? Because what I understand from it is Malays are actually hybrid races, but bonded by those three values. It is a membership of a club, actually. If you are Muslim, in fact, there is a term where you can become Malay, maksud Melayu. As long as you embrace Islam and you follow these two other tenets, and then you are Malay. I mean, what do you know from history?
Okay, thank you for that. That's the constitutional definition. Because it's a constitutional definition, it's completely artificial, of course. Just because something's written down doesn't make it correct. Right. Now, that is a completely historically constructed definition. And we know how and why it comes about in 1957. Now, two things. First thing, if you define every Malay as being necessarily Muslim, then basically the history of Malaya goes back only to the 13th century. Prior to that, there was nothing. We were in a vacuum. And it means that all our ancestors, all the ancestors of the Malays today were not Malays then. I don't know what they were. Maybe Eskimos or something, they were building all these chandis.
Let me just add a bit on that, because if you're talking about being a Muslim before 30th century, actually, I mean, from my reading of old text, the word Muslim, it doesn't actually mean something from Muhammad. It is actually something from Adam. And because the word Muslim means submission to God. There was a quite egalitarian definition of what a Muslim means. Passed from the Prophet, and even in the old text, it was said that the old religion was the Shariat of Abraham. And that is a Muslim.
So I congratulate you for taking that more universalistic and pluralistic and accommodative view, I recommend you take that idea to Jakim now and try to convince them. Because I agree with you. Yeah, no problems with that. You see?
Otherwise, because the idea is, if you put that egalitarian idea, that it was submission to God. It's just the method differs according to the times. And all the prophets carry the same message, but along the way there were deviations from the path, and prophets after tried to repair that. And if you put that concept, that everything, as long as you believe in the one God, then you are a Muslim. And it's only the methods differ, and then, but nowadays, the terms has been restricted to Muslim as the religion carried by Prophet Muhammad, and then it is put forward as something that something that came later and invade the other religion and kick out the natives or something like that.
Okay, well, okay. Let me answer your original question. I mean, the point you made is a very important theological one. We can go into a separate debate on that, because that's actually a very, very important component of early Islam in Southeast Asia that was far more accommodative. Just go to Terengganu and look at the Terengganu inscription. This is stone, which is supposed to be the earliest marker of the arrival of Islam to the Malaysian Peninsula. This is a famous Batu Bersurat, and it actually has the Muslim declaration of faith. Except, funnily enough, it doesn't have the word Allah in it. It doesn't have the word Allah in it. It has the term Dewata Mulia Raya. Dewata Mulia Raya. It's a Sanskrit term. So we have Dewa Mulia Raya, the great noble Deva. And that was how, today these guys will all be arrested by Jakim for writing that. But in those days, in the absence of a vocabulary, that they could actually express their conversion to this new faith by using a term. And this precisely goes back to the point again about language, you see. The comfort of being able to actually use a language that is hybrid and polyglot in itself, to actually express your identity without the fear of loss, and panic. So the first thing about the constitutional definition, if you accept the constitutional definition, strictly speaking, literally interpreted, and technically there were no Malays before the 13th century. So that's already a huge historical conundrum. One. Two, the idea that to adhere to Malay customs or to speak the lingua franca, but like I said, this was the state of things prior to the mid-19th century anyway, and everyone was like that, simply because nobody laid claim to this lingua franca. It was a lingua franca, it belonged to everyone. You call it bahasa pasar, the bazaar language, the language of the market, because that was the language used in the public domain. So the difference is then, you had a public domain that was actually public, that actually allowed for this overlapping and interpenetration and this cross-fertilization to take place. And that's why the cultures of Southeast Asia were so rich. And I think what we've seen now, historically, is the steady impoverishment of these respective communities, as everyone gets corralled into their little boxes, like sheep that are put in different pens and kept apart from each other. So the constitutional definition is precisely something that emerges in 57, the constitutional definition of what a Malay is, emerges in 57, and it's another example of how this colonized mindset comes in, because it basically racializes Malayness. It turns Malays into a race. Now, oddly enough, if you go back to your history, there are always counterfactual examples. 1946, Dr. Burhanuddin Al-Helmi, who I think was one of the most progressive thinkers that Malaysia ever produced at the time, the man really who should have been the first Prime Minister of Malaysia, wrote a book that was called Asas Falsafah Kebangsaan Melayu Malaysia. It's a funny title. When you read it, it's written in Jawi, by the way. Now, he defines Melayu as anyone who was born in Southeast Asia, lives in Southeast Asia, and regards Southeast Asia as her or his home. So what he's done is he's de-racialized Malayness. He has de-racialized Malayness. Malayness is no longer linked to blood or genetics or your genetic history.
I do believe in that, because when we were let me just interject, because when you mentioned that a lot of these put things in boxes came about during the colonization. And you mentioned something in the 1870s, which is when the British got the Chinese miners who come by the droves, but divided them from the natives. Otherwise, they could have just mixed around and become the original Malay.
Right.
Perhaps.
Yeah, precisely. And that's why the loss of these Peranakan communities. One very significant. There's no record, for instance, of all the lost, quote unquote. I don't even like using terms like Malay, Chinese, Indian, by the way. But if there's something that I believe nobody's actually studied significantly enough, is the loss of the so-called Chinese countryside. All these communities where you have actually mixed villages are not even in our history books anymore. What we have now are the so-called Chinese settlements that were actually created during the emergency. And where were all these Chinese settlements? Yeah? They were in places like Perak. Why? Because people from the Chinese villages, who were actually kampung Chinese, were moved into these artificial towns. And so you create these artificial entities, and you don't allow society to develop organically. But whereas if you look at what little documentary evidence we have, is that these were actually mixed kampungs. Some would be there would be more Malays than Chinese, there would be more Chinese than Indians, but actually it meant that even in the countryside, today we have this stereotype when we talk about Kelantan, the Malay heartland, all Malays over there. And the idea that once you pass, the invisible wall of wilayah persekutuan, you have to carry a pistol, you're in the Malay heartland. That notion of the countryside as being Malay is something that we have to contest, because there is enough historical evidence to suggest that there were not many, but there were these mixed perkampungan areas. And this is also something that was A, diminished during the late colonial period, and B, we perpetuate this historical erasure in our history books in the post-colonial period. We don't make an attempt to actually recover the traces of these mixed, shared oral spaces. Yes.
Sorry, I can't help myself. As a Sabahan, I think that Malay and Malaysia needs to learn a lot from Sabah Sarawak, where this mix is still very much there, and that this notion of Malay is very new. There wasn't Malay in Sabah Sarawak till 63 onwards, or around that time. This notion of the Malay wasn't there. There were other groupings or headings that there were at the time. But what worries me now in terms of the other side of Malaysia is this homogenizing of a singular culture that doesn't allow for difference within the orang asli community or native community.
No, I share your sympathies as well. I grew up in Sabah for 4 years, and it is a far cooler place than West Malaysia anytime. I mean, just go there and you get blown up by how relaxed people are about questions of precisely food, dress, culture, and being able to actually literally live side by side and live together. Not in the Jawi Kalwat sense, but live together in genuine appreciation for each other. Don't know Kalwat, it's not that bad, by the way. But anyway. Yeah, and I agree with you that again this goes back to the idea of colonial governmentality, governance itself. This is the problem. Governance is a modern concept. It comes at a particular period in the evolution of late capitalism. It comes in the creation of centralized states, centralized governments, the notion that the